afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well. I'm Sam Brown. I'm the head of PR at 72 Point, and we are here with OnePoll and the PRCA to look at how we can drive positive and accurate language in women's health communications. If I just can introduce the panel to you. First of all, I've got Gareth Lucy. Gareth is Comms Director at global hygiene and healthcare company Essity, parent brand to Tenor, Bodyform, and many others. We have Ilian Morrison. Lovely to see you, Ilian. Ilian is birth and trauma specialist and a midwife and an online content creator. And we have Susanna, Galton, who is freelance health and real life at many publications, including the Daily Telegraph. So lovely to have you all here today.
Nice to be here.
And thank you everyone for joining us. It's quite a wide discussion point today, because obviously this is quite a treacherous industry part that we're in at the moment. I want to first of all start looking at outdated language. Now, the OnePoll survey did look at how language is affecting women's interpretations and women's receptiveness and engaged manner with their healthcare. So, first of all, Ilian, can I come to you as an NHS healthcare professional? Are you seeing a change in the language that is being used, both in healthcare and in social media?
Yeah, there's definitely a move to change. I think really there's a lot of, perhaps the real barrier is a generational barrier. So perhaps those who have been working within these services for longer have become very much accustomed to the language that they are used to using.
Oh, sorry to jump in. I'm really sorry to. You're talking about the people that have been working in healthcare as opposed to the consumers. So exactly, like the older doctors and nurses out there. Okay, got
exactly.
it.
So from the obstetric perspective in maternity, you might find that very senior obstetricians are using different language than the more junior obstetricians and midwives. This is sometimes because it's habit, other times because they are actually choosing not to change the language that they are using. So there's sort of a mix of both.
And what would be an example of an old word that was used in a new interpretation of that? Because I know we talk about geriatric pregnancies and things like that that's still in use. What might be one of the ones that has changed a little?
So you'll find ones like failure to progress, which is now called not progressing according to protocol, or slow progress. So it takes away such a negative connotation of failure, and really it's saying, according to what the protocol says, you haven't done this, which kind of gives the protocol the blame rather than the person.
Yeah.
And so that leaves people, from a trauma perspective, it leaves people feeling much less sort of responsible for having failed. Language that we're sort of, incompetent cervix, geriatric pregnancy.
What's an incompetent cervix? That's one I've never heard before, I will say.
Yeah, so obviously the cervix is like the opening of the uterus, and sometimes some women might have where their cervix does not or begins to open early in pregnancy. So that is then classed as not competent to maintain the pregnancy. There are things that we do in order to manage this. However, it's not about the cervix being incompetent. And again, that language puts the blame on the person who has the cervix, rather than it being something that can actually happen in pregnancy. So those types of that type of language we're trying to kind of filter out, but obviously these things take time. It's a massive system that we are trying to work with, but also Peanut, the mum what is it, like platform, created a renaming revolution, where they took all of these phrases and they were saying, right, we need to change them, which I think has actually been really good from a sort of user perspective, in terms of giving the user or the patient the power to choose a language that works for them and recognizing that there can be change. So that's been a really good move, and I think that it is definitely having a good impact.
And from a patient perspective, what is the patient's perception of this language? Are they fearful? And I've heard you say that it makes them feel less inadequate as a person. What does that language do to people?
Yeah, so I think, you know, from again, from a trauma perspective, it's going to be that people are feeling like they are at fault. So, for example, in let's say if someone has a miscarriage, they what we can call, what they considered a baby, is a product of conception. Now, for them, if they have
Wow.
longed for this baby, for it to then be referred to as a product of
Products. Yeah.
conception, really does trivialize what they've gone through and can really take away some of that sort of sense of, actually, I faced a huge loss here. And so the change in language gives them the power back to be like, actually, no, this is what's happening, rather than it feeling like a blame game. And particularly in women's health, we know that misogyny is very rife. And so this language is predominantly used about things that happen to women, incompetent cervixes, but we don't have incompetent scrotums. You know, we don't, it's not it's not the language that we use when speaking about men's health. And so we are kind of, you know, from I suppose a feminist perspective as well, definitely a much more empowering use of language for those who choose to use it. And ultimately, that is what it comes down to, is choice. This isn't a blanket thing that we say everyone needs to be offended by this language, everyone like it. If it doesn't offend you, that is absolutely fine. But if it does, know that there is language that can be used instead, and that you can request for that language to be used.
Yeah. Susanna, can I come to you from a writing perspective? Because obviously you write about women's health and you do a little bit of men's health as well, don't you? What differences do you see there?
In terms of women's health, I think just as the point we've heard, there is a lot of sort of misogynistic language out there, or it's very dated. And although it probably isn't meant to be at all hurtful, it can be very disempowering when it's used, and it can be, if you're in health, so if you're in poor health or in hospital for any reason, you're probably feeling quite vulnerable. So to hear some of these words used, such as incompetent or geriatric, it can just feel hurtful at a time when actually you need as much help as possible to feel as empowered as possible. In terms of male language, I suppose I was thinking we have erectile dysfunction, but apart from those things, I can't think of many others that it's so negative towards the male. I think women are seen to be at fault through some of the language we're using.
And Gareth, coming to yourself, how are things changing from a brand side of things? Have you seen any, from on your various brands that you work across, what are you seeing with differences in language from, say, a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last decade, we've seen a real shift in the way brands approach these subjects. I mean, I always kind of start these discussions by saying I think brands have to shoulder some responsibility for the kind of historic taboos that have been created. You go back 15 years, 20 years, advertising for period products, for incontinence products was very different to what it is today. It was, you know, didn't really reflect the reality of it, if we're being honest. I think that started to shift. You know, thankfully we've lost the blue liquid in period product adverts, but that was still around 8 years ago, incredibly.
And Bodyform, one of your brands, was the first to do that, wasn't it?
Bodyform was the first to get rid of the blue liquid. Sorry?
When did that change happen, the blue to the red?
2016, so pretty recent.
Amazing that it's taken that long, but well done, first of all, for doing it, because it was a very,
you know, and even since then, you know, in the last 7-8 years, it's the first time we've seen the products shown in situ as opposed to in the packaging, which is mind-blowing, really. But 10 years ago, brands weren't brave enough to show their product, only the packaging. So how we can expect to break the taboos around these subjects and encourage people to talk about them when we as the brands weren't confident enough to show our own products in situ, you know, I think it tells its own story. That's the real shift in the last decade, where we've started to see now.
Why do you think that might have been? And I'm asking you as the brand spokesperson. I know it wasn't you that made this problem. It's come from far back. But why do you think that is? Is it the ick factor that we don't think that the public can take it, or the public won't take it? Or...
I think there's two things. I think, first of all, there was legislation around advertising about what you could and couldn't show. So blood in advertising is quite a recent thing. You couldn't show it. Your ad wouldn't pass the necessary tests that it goes through to be allowed to show it on TV. So it would be a flat no, you can't. You'd have to change that scene, and so that was the primary reason we physically weren't allowed to show some of the things that we felt were necessary. But you're absolutely right. The second factor is you have to think about what the average consumer sitting at home at a particular time of day wants to see and what they don't want to see. You know, when people are eating the cornflakes or when they're watching TV with their children, do they want to see certain things depicted? And you have to obviously consider that. But of course, now as we talk more about the need to talk about these issues and to break taboos, I think, unfortunately, if you're not upsetting some people, you're probably not breaking the taboo.
And it's interesting because it's interesting what you're saying about the audience reaction, because I think the communications within a female healthcare, like in a health magazine, would be very different to how we talk about it in a news publication, which would likewise be very different about how we talk about it on social media platforms as well. Ilian, are you noticing, Gareth was just talking about the different approvals that you needed to go through, and you weren't allowed to show red blood. There's still a lot of restrictions around Meta and social media. Are you seeing a change there as well about whether it's how graphic or how open people are being in that situation?
So I think people want to be. I definitely, and you know, if we take Instagram back to the bare bones, it was a photo sharing app, meaning that we would be trying to capture attention with imagery. As things pass, there are lots more infograms, and people are kind of working with the algorithm to see what they can do, what gets passed and not. But again, imagery is sometimes really good in order for people to actually feel seen. When we're speaking about delicate topics, which for the person who is writing it is perhaps not delicate for those, but for that person who is receiving it through years of taboo around these topics, but also for them it being a very intimate topic, sometimes the imagery can work really well, but we are being stopped in some way. So, for example, I would post a lot about birth, breastfeeding, things like that. And with something like breastfeeding, you have imagery. Like, we want to show people how to do it, which means that we might have a nipple. And
Lord forbid.
I heaven forbid. And that would be taken down, or I would get warnings if there's a video on birth. And you know, the thing is, what we've got now in the mainstream media is programs about birth that just look a little bit like they're missing it. So it's like the woman's in labor and she's writhing and she's screaming and all the rest, and then everything's covered up and she has a baby at the end, or you see just her
nice and clean baby, all been washed out
or you're just
already.
not really seeing that babies come out of vaginas. And so it's like, you know, so what we might get is a lot of the, you know, people in theatres or, you know, things like that, but we're not seeing the kind of what we want to understand is normal vaginal birth. And so if you're trying to share that on social media, again, you know, it's being deleted, or it's being flagged, or accounts are being deleted and things like that for breaches. Whereas like sharing normal bodily function with explanation and from perspectives that are educational shouldn't be deemed as I don't know, you know, graphic content. However, I do understand that we should have perhaps content warnings or sensitive warnings, because some people may not want to see it. But again, we should have choice around what we are able to consume, and as people who share this content, what we are wanting to share. But you know,
I think it's interesting when we look at something like Instagram. You may have a classic content creator influencer you're following because you like the way they dress, or you follow their art, or whatever it is. But I think if you're seeing it in that platform versus seeing it on a health channel, I think there are different restrictions there as well. There's a really interesting stat that's come out of the OnePoll survey, and it's that 90% of women use social media for healthcare information. Now, I'm going to move on to social. I'm going to go quite deep into social because I think it's a territory that is really, really important right now. There is a rise of the fake expert, and there is some confusion maybe from consumers about who to listen to and how to know that they're telling the truth in what they're doing. What's your experience of that, Ilian?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because I definitely think, yes, qualification is important, experience is very important. However, there are going to be those people who don't have a classic qualification, who are experts in what they do. And I think there has to be a level of responsibility from both parties to express this. So, actually, no, I don't have a degree, but I have years of experience in this area, and I can back that up with this, and this. And that we as consumers should be asking that of people that we are consuming information from. So, a lot of the time it goes out, oh, the fake expert is the problem, but also if we're going to make a decision based on what someone online is telling us, we should be asking them if they are qualified to give us that information.
Do people ask you that out of interest?
So when I first started using social media, I would have people say, what qualifies you? And I'm like, this degree qualifies me, it's blood, sweat and tears.
Yeah.
But, now it's not so much. I think I've definitely proven myself, which I don't think is a bad thing. I've earned people's trust. I'm speaking to them about very vulnerable topics. And if we are going to seek sort of clarification from people for certain things, if anything has to come first, it's got to be our children and our health. So I want people to say, where did you get that information from, or why do you believe that, or what can you back this up with? Make me work for it. It's fine. I'm happy to work. And if you get the opposite of someone being like, don't question me, I know this stuff, that is a bit of a red flag.
That's a red flag, exactly. If they're not willing to be taken to task on it.
Exactly.
Gareth, we've had some very interesting work in this space from Bodyform as well. I know Bodyform's been through their own social media journey. Can you just explain a little bit about what was happening with the shadow banning that you had?
Yes, yeah. So we did a campaign last year where we highlighted 40 different words or phrases that were being shadow banned. And all of these 40 words and phrases were anatomically and medically correct. So we weren't using slang terms, and the campaign was born out of our own experience as a brand when we were trying.
And Gareth, just to clarify, we're not talking about extreme words. We're talking about words like vagina.
Exactly, vagina, vulva, but even health terms like endometriosis or heavy period was one of them, or one of the phrases. So we're talking about words and phrases, as I say, medically and anatomically correct, and they're being shadow banned, and we would get an automated message saying that we are trying to post overly sexualized content. So that's the link from the social media companies. They see it as being sexualized content, which frankly I think is ridiculous. And so we launched this campaign highlighting these 40 words, and of course what happened, the campaign itself was shadow banned. We kind of knew that would happen, and we knew that would be quite an interesting outcome of trying to highlight these words, and actually the campaign itself therefore being banned. And we've pushed quite hard on that because, from our perspective, and you used the stat earlier, women and particularly young women are taking to social media to try and find information about certain health conditions and certain health issues, but even just about periods. And the information that they might be trying to find is being censored, which makes it hard for them to find. So in effect, we've created this additional taboo where somebody has got the confidence to go and look for the information and they can't find it because it's being censored. And I mentioned earlier, endometriosis is a classic example, really serious, painful condition that, somebody might not be confident enough at this stage to go and speak to their GP about, just wants to go and find out some more information about it, and they can't.
And want to find the information in a space that they're comfortable in. So it's not necessarily about going on the NHS website. They might want information that has been through the filter of peers or been through the filter of online creators that they trust. So
exactly, and it's social media. It's social. The idea is that you can find like-minded individuals. You can find somebody who's going through the same thing and have a conversation, and that's what's being stopped.
I think endometriosis is a really interesting one, actually, Gareth, because it's one of those classic things that takes years to diagnose, and that might be because people aren't educated enough on it because they're not having access to this information.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. I mean, from personal experience, my own wife It took her 3 years to be diagnosed with endometriosis. She went through very painful periods, borderline phoning an ambulance in the middle of the night.
Wow.
We didn't know what the problem was, and then eventually you get the diagnosis. But yeah, 3 years. And that, I believe that's pretty typical.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting. I remember reports over the years in the past where GPs have flagged a worry where people have been using Dr. Google to diagnose themselves. Ilian, I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this. What are you getting people coming to you and saying? Are they coming to you and saying, I've hit Google, or I saw something on Instagram, or is it a mix of all of that?
Yeah, I think Instagram is probably the new Google.
Okay, interesting.
And it's not, and people still use Google, but then they might go to social media. So they might use TikTok instead and be able to find a lot of videos. So for example, let's say lump in my breast, right? So you'll Google that and then it says, that could be cancer, because Google says everyone's got cancer.
Yeah.
And then they'll go to TikTok or Instagram and be like, cancer symptoms, and then watch someone or watch hundreds of videos of people speaking about all their symptoms. And then so I think it is working on like a more personable level, because what you're getting if you go to Google is like WebMD or whatever. Whereas then you go and you look at actual real people and you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, she's talking about what I know and blah, 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 blah. And so again, it's really good. But obviously what we then end up with is people spiraling into sort of anxiety and self-diagnosis. And as the professionals, you're trying to kind of talk them down. So you want to take them right to the beginning. So there's, essentially what we're needing is we've left people out into the ether where they're just kind of trying to diagnose themselves. And then they go to their healthcare professional and they need to be held and guided and supported. And the healthcare professional says, well, you can have a scan in 2025, or you can come and see your GP for 7 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
So they aren't necessarily getting that hand-holding. And so what we've got is a lot of health anxiety that is running ragged, and it is very difficult to control. And I think that it is probably exacerbated by social media, because in many ways misery loves company, and you'll find a lot of negative stories on social media because one, they're kind of, this sounds bad, but they're clickbaity. People invest in them, rather than seeing someone who comes to the end of their story and says, how I overcame cancer, now in remission. You're more likely to click on the story that says, my cancer diagnosis at 21 years old. So that kind of stuff you're seeing a lot of, rather than people being able to consume the kind of positive side, or be able to go to their healthcare professional and get the reassurance that they need. So I think we do have very sort of health anxious population, and those needs are not necessarily being met.
So in the same way that Martin Lewis is very clear about, I don't do ads, and he's very clear about he doesn't attach himself to any brand or product. There are likewise a lot of specialists in the finance industry that are online. How could a consumer know who's to be trusted on social media and who isn't?
Yeah, I mean, so it can be quite difficult in that sense. I mean, Meta have verification, which you can get, which shows that you are the real person. And you have to, in order to get verification, you have to essentially be known in lots of spaces. So you have to be Googleable. So people can see the work that you've done. You have to have been in the press, or you have to be a real person. That kind of helps in terms of being able to prove someone is who they are. However, that did change when people could buy verification, because Meta was like, oh yeah, we can make more money, and so now the blue tick isn't necessarily as trustworthy as it once was.
Even what we're saying is even their own authentication is potentially leading consumers down quite a dodgy road, effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's very difficult. I think it's based on that person would have to be going out and doing their own work beyond social media. And sometimes, there are very strict laws, for example, around formula advertising. So, as healthcare professionals, particularly midwives, we aren't allowed to advertise formula. So even if you see your favorite midwife content creator perhaps advertising formula, that kind of brings into question their integrity.
That authenticity, yeah.
Because we aren't actually allowed to do it, so
Mm.
how much were you paid in order to get you to do it?
Yeah, and
so
bend your own rules and your own
exactly.
ethics.
So you can
Yeah.
kind of do your own maths, but sometimes it does not really matter. If someone is attractive to them, if they like what they're saying, if they feel that they can relate or connect with them, it does take a lot to kind of prove them untrustworthy, even if thousands of people are going, they're a red flag. If you like them, you like them. So, you know.
Okay, stats, 19% of consumers trust what they see on social media and they use an authenticated source. Is that the correct stat? Sorry. Now, only a small amount higher than that is 22% believe media is accurate, editorial media. Susanna, I'd love to hear your process. What do you do to check that what you are saying is correct?
Well, I think there's various higher standards that you probably get in sort of mainstream media compared to social. First of all, things are written by a journalist who has been trained to speak to experts to try and condense perhaps complicated concepts and make them more readable. And they wouldn't just be interviewing someone that got off the street, but they'd be going through checks to make sure that person had the authority to give their opinion and advice. Then when it's written up, it would go through a sub-editing process, which is fact-checking for statistics and links and everything else to make it accurate as possible. It goes through another editing process before it's normally built for online. So there's various things in going into the piece of work. And also you can change things. If it's online, you can react to things, and there's general sort of standard boards and independent boards that you could complain to if there was an issue. So I think there's just levels there of accuracy that are in place. But it is a shame that if there's only 22% that are trusting the accuracy of things, I think that's a shame and it's surprising.
I think what's interesting though is how the wild west of social media has potentially had a knock-on effect. That impression that the respect and the trust that consumers have in it. Yeah, I think it's not back onto mainstream media as well. And so if you have something put in front of you that you question, where do you go to for that? Would you go to a charity? Would you go back to the brand?
I think all of those things. I think you'd go back to all those sources and look for more verification. I think readers coming to these things and should come with a questioning mind rather than totally believing what they say. But it's good to use different sources.
And do we think the comms? How does the comms differ? How are they different in female spaces? And I am talking about this in a very binary way. I understand that, but how are those comms different in female spaces versus mainstream news spaces? Do you alter your language? Is there a different take on it?
I don't know. I mean, I think with the problem that we have with language, often people won't want to use vagina or vulva, which then creates a sort of, often people don't actually know the difference. We can use euphemisms like down there. I think I've done one piece on sort of intimate health that was called, what's up down there. So I think the more these sort of euphemisms are bandied about in any form of media, it's quite difficult for people then to go to a doctor if they need help
and explain in real terms.
Terminology. Yes. So I think that's an issue.
Gareth, what's your experience of that? Do you alter the terminology depending on the platform that you're using?
We try not to. We try where possible now to use the correct terminology, because I think if we don't, we're doing, as we said earlier, we're saying that there's a reason not to use the correct term or the correct phrase. We should be embarrassed of it, or we should hide it for some reason. So no, we try to use the correct terminology, but as mentioned, it's difficult, particularly on social media. But also from a PR perspective, you'll get some fantastic journalists who are very open to writing about this sort of stuff, and clearly, Susanna is one of those. You'll also get, I mean, I've had it said to me, sorry, it doesn't pass the cornflakes test. And I said, sorry, what do you mean? And they say, well, things like incontinence periods, people don't want to read about that when they're eating their cornflakes, so therefore we can't print it. You know, we can't print a story about it. Doesn't matter how important it is, doesn't matter what the insight is, or how you know, integral that could be to the wider conversation around women's health. If you get somebody who tells you, sorry, you know, we can't write about that, or we can't put that in, that's the end of it. So we do get that, and we still get that, particularly on some of the incontinence related news and research that we might try and put out. But I think it's changing for the, you know, for the better. I think it's becoming less. I think as brands get more confident, and then you know, journalists perhaps in the health sections get more confident about using the right terminology, that starts to seep out into other areas, but there's still a long way to go.
I think also, an issue is everything has to be sort of visually impactful, and some of these issues are quite hard to demonstrate visually. Just to pitch to an editor, they're not going to want something very graphic on the pages or online. So we somehow have to work together to get around that. Not just have a very sort of coy picture of an unhappy looking lady or a sort of sad face pair of pants. You know, there needs to be some group work, I think, to try and come up with new ideas for illustrating things.
So I'm conscious that on the webinar today, there's probably going to be a lot of brand comms people. So Gareth, I'm going to ask you quite a big question. From a brand comms perspective. When Bodyform removed the blue, when it went red, was that bold or responsible?
I think it was both. I think being the first is always, you know, requires you to be bold. It's easy to just carry on as you are. So I think it was a bold decision in terms, well, for two things: a bold decision in terms of it brought reality to the situation. You know, no, it's never been blue. Nobody bleeds blue. So it brought reality to the situation. But it was
I will say though, as a young lady growing up, I looked forward to getting my periods because I thought it meant that I could then jump out of an aeroplane.
I know, I remember that.
What was going to happen.
Yes, yeah.
So responsible comms. That's what.
Yeah, and there you go. And that was, you know, my first point really about historic blame. I think there's a role there for sure, and that has changed and needed to change. But yeah, I think the other reason that it was bold to make that move was because we knew there would be complaints. We still get that. We still, you know, people are not happy.
Still now, all these years down the line.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's from men and women of all different ages. But people will be
comments. I'd be really interested to see what the comments were there. Are they saying, we don't need to see that, or what is the actual? Yeah,
absolutely. So we don't, you know, we don't need to see it. We're embarrassing women. We're showing inappropriate things when it's daytime and therefore children can see it. You know, you wouldn't believe we get a lot of negative comments by trying to be bold and trying to, you know, I wouldn't say we're not trying to be controversial. Or trying to be, you know, kind of so in your face that it demands a response. We're just trying to be real, in effect. We're trying to give the reality of the situation now. Every period is different, but generally blood is involved, and therefore why should we not depict that, and why should we not show the product in situ in the different realities that women face? You know, you're not always at home. You might be at work. You might be at a party, middle of the night, you might be asleep. You know, there's lots of different scenarios that, you know, people need to be confident that their scenario is not unique, and that there are products there for them that can support them, and that shows the reality of the situation and doesn't hide behind it. Otherwise, I question, what are we here for? We're just reinforcing the taboo.
Yeah. So what we're really talking about here is breaking that taboo. I'd be really interested to get your thoughts, Ilian and Susanna, as well, about how do we do this? How do we move forward? And how do we, as responsible comms people, responsible brand people, how do we move forward through that? Do we stick our head above the parapet and hope for the best, or how do we attack that?
From my perspective, I definitely think yes. I you know, to be honest with you, we want to be disruptors of the status quo. You know, we want to. We we've lived amongst these norms for a very long time, and so actually, yes, there is always a risk. You know, for example, on my own social media, I definitely could have kept it all very professional, only speaking about midwifery, blah blah blah. But actually, what I found over the last 3.5 years is that people want people. They want human. They want to know stories. They want to see who's behind brands. They want to see ideas and development, and they want to see all of that. They want to kind of,
and that's where trust comes from as well.
Yeah, it definitely is. And so it's like they want to see the red blood. Yes, it might be uncomfortable for some people, but then, we go back to that autonomy of like, turn it over then. If you don't like it, turn it over. It shouldn't be that we change it.
We'll see red blood if they're talking about a war zone or a car accident or something like that. But if it's coming out of a private part, certainly. So Susanna, how long before we see that on the paper, in the paper?
I'm not sure about that, but certainly, I mean, I think it's just ridiculous that the word vagina and technically endometriosis should be a taboo. These are just technical terms. So I think we all have to make an effort to work towards just using the correct language. And I think Ilian made a good point about people want, certainly in the media, real life stories. So people want to be able to relate to something. So the more brands can find really strong case studies, I think that will get messages across as well.
Yeah. And I also, you can just be really creative with it. We don't have to be graphic, because on top of that, there are actually people who just don't like to see that, not because they feel shame or anything like that. But we can be creative while also being realistic and not being sort of horrendously graphic or crass or however people. And also we've got to look at where we're going. So the newspaper, what age bracket are buying newspapers and reading them? Who's watching television, who's using social media, and kind of working according to the audience. And I think that's obviously, I'm not teaching people how to suck eggs, but it's definitely how I think lots of these decisions are made based on who the consumer is. The Telegraph is not going to start putting a woman on her period because who's reading the Telegraph?
Yep, no. Targeted media coverage is definitely the way forward.
There we go.
Safe spaces in some cases as well. Gareth, there's a question on the forum for you. So, did the decision to show the reality periods increase your sales of the brand?
Good question. I mean, there's so many factors obviously involved over the course of a year in terms of volume growth and sales growth. But broadly, if we look at Bodyform over the last 7-8 years, it's been a growing brand. Particularly in 2023, it had a really good year, and that coincides with the change in how we talk as a brand. So this move away from only showing packaging, blue liquid, a very kind of scientific setting, to the realities of periods. So of course, as I say, I caveat that answer a little bit by saying there's so many factors involved, in terms of availability, price, of course, all of these things. But yes, my simple answer would be that yes, since changing the way that the brand speaks, we've seen a real improvement, and also big improvement also in perception of the brand, in terms of when we do research and we look at how consumers feel about Bodyform and what their perception of the brand are, we've seen real improvements there as well. I think people appreciate a brand that tries to tell it how it is.
And deals the reality of what the consumer's going through. So,
absolutely.
Well, I hope I can still jump out of an aeroplane. That's what I would like to put out there. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to ask you the question. Is there a word that you wish people understood better in women's health comms? If you had to pick one.
I think I'd go for endometriosis then. I think
it's such a widespread issue as well, and one that is, in many ways, they have a cloak over the top of it that we don't talk about.
I can't see why that would be shaded at all.
I agree. I think same applies though to any condition like that. ridiculous that it can't be talked about openly and honestly in a public way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I would be looking at failure just associated with anything. You know, failure to progress, failure to poor maternal effort or failed maternal effort or anything like that. I think we need to take away that negative connotation. So failure before anything is something I think we should stamp out.
Lovely. If anyone else has got any questions, please do pop them in the forum. And so the last thing I'm going to ask you is, what can we all do better as brand people and as content creators? What can we all do better? Big question, I know.
From my perspective, I think we've got really good at saying we need to talk about these things, but I'm not sure we've created the spaces to actually talk about them.
Very good point. Which is the menopause conversation in
absolutely.
many ways.
I think that's a real opportunity for brands going forward, not only to emphasize the importance of breaking taboos and talking about our health, but creating the opportunity for us to do that. Because it's very easy to say, yes, go and talk about it, but just saying that doesn't give people the confidence or the physical space to do it. So I think for me, that's a real opportunity going forward for brands, is to create that space, create those communities, those forums, whatever it might be, but give people the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah, I also think it'd be really useful to have a set of guidelines that was recognised to encourage the press to use, so they do use the correct language and non-offensive things, and stop using outdated things, but just to get those messages spread in a wider audience, I think.
Yeah, I think, you know, creating spaces that extend beyond social media. There's so many limitations to social media, and I think taking conversations offline and into the real world, or even into like more intimate settings where people can get beyond the kind of immediate anxiety of, oh my God, to actually let's talk it through. So really creating, you know, sort of like a pathway rather than it just being flash, red, and that's it.
And there's another question that's just popped up. So specifically over Ilian and Susanna, there's a huge confusion about, as we were saying, about women's biology, e.g. the way vagina and vulva are used very interchangeably, and in the wrong way most of the time. So do you think there's still a school and educational problem, and maybe new generations are more educated than what we think? Are you seeing that? Yeah,
totally. I mean, I think most of the problems that we have now are starting in school. Where are we getting our learning from? You know, where do we pick up on these behaviors and these taboos and things like that? Toilets at schools, or girls not being able to leave classrooms when they're on their periods, and creating shame around things. So it's everywhere, and the lack of autonomy that we have to even ask people to change language because of our perception of authority figures in terms of, like, at school, well, we don't say no to the teacher, or we don't correct them or whatever. If we give people their voices back from very young, they then are able to kind of do their learning but also express themselves comfortably. So, you know, schools are where we could start a lot of change and filter it through.
Yeah, I think I would entirely agree.
Sorry, carry on, Susanna.
No, I think I would entirely agree with that point. I think it needs to start in schools, but also if kids are, and anyone else is going to be using social media in schools, at least they could guide them to which sites are informative and accurate. Otherwise, it is a bit like the Wild West. You sort of are in there and you could fall anywhere. But if you have some guidance on who to follow, what to look at, that would help.
Gareth, were you taught about girls' health when you were a schoolboy?
No, we were taken out of the classroom, and
you
again,
were physically removed.
Physically taken out of the room. Wow. Yes. So this was a point. I mean, we've done a whole nother piece of work on period equity, but the education side is critical, because for me at that age, what it created was secrecy. You know, and at a young age, you know, young boys, what they tend to do, they don't understand something, they tease about it. So they don't ask sensible questions, not when you're 8-9 years old. So yeah, I and my fellow boys in my class were taken out of the room, and we were just allowed to play football or whatever it might be for the next half hour while the girls learned about periods. For me, that's got to be dual educated. you know, take the boys out if that creates a more comfortable environment for young girls, but teach the boys as well. Otherwise, you are creating the taboo, and that goes that from that age, you take that through life.
Yeah. Well, just speaking from my own experience, I went to an all-girls senior school. Was taught about periods by a male teacher, and it was one lesson in an all-girls school. So 40 minutes of education. Brilliant. So anybody got any more points to make? Otherwise we'll wrap. Yeah, we can wrap shortly. Ilian, I know that you're quite passionate about specifically the birthing process and spreading the good news there. Is it first, can you give me your Instagram so that people know where to follow you?
Yeah, it's at Mixing Up Motherhood. So it's all about women's autonomy, agency, kind of, you know, intersectionality, and, you know, how to do better by women in those processes.
And Gareth, there's one last question that's just popped up. Where can people access the 40 terms? Because you had the 40 words that you mentioned before that were banned.
I can share a link if it's possible to do that with everybody that's dialed in. But otherwise, I'm 99% sure they're on the Bodyform website, but I'll double check that.
I think they're on the Bodyform website as well, actually saying that. I'm quite sure they are. They are definitely on the Bodyform social media pages as well, should there needs to be. Okay. And on that note,
Sam, if I can just jump in for a second, I've had a separate question, I think. So if it's okay, I'll answer it.
Please.
It's somebody's asked me, how do you communicate to the LGBTQIA plus community when it comes to women's health, which I think is a really important question. So from a brand perspective, we try to be very inclusive with our language. So some people have a view on this, rightly or wrongly. We use the term women plus to try and be inclusive, but I think it's a really good question. There is no concrete answer on that. I don't think there's no guidance. Brands have to sort of find their own way. It's one of those spaces where I often feel that you can't do right and you can't do wrong. We talk about women plus, we get quite aggressive comments back up from women who say that we are degrading women by adding a plus. But of course, you know, you take that away and then you're not being inclusive. So it's a really challenging area, but it's a really important area. Are we perfect? Not yet. We need to find our way as well. But it's certainly something we take seriously and we want to get right.
Lovely, thank you. Just before we wrap, are there any other questions sitting on people's pages that we need to deal with? I think we're okay. Okay, and on that note, thank you so much for coming together today. It's really, it's been really, really beneficial. So thank you to the PRCA for putting this together, and thank you for OnePoll for actually putting together all the data. Oh, hang on, there's one term. When I've supported women in business. It wasn't a question, it was a point. Okay, lovely. Thank you so much, everyone. If there are any questions for the panel that you do want to get in, please go back to the PRCA and they'll filter all the questions through and we'll get answers for you as soon as possible. But thank you so much for coming together. It's a really, really important subject. And I think we've got plenty of discussion points which we could potentially take on to the next discussion. So thanks all.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Take care. Bye-bye.